The air was thick with the scent of cinnamon rolls and old hardwood polish as I stood in the kitchen, holding the mug just a moment too long, pretending to sip. I could feel his presence behind me before he even spoke. "You always hum when you're nervous," he said, leaning just enough to catch my eye. His voice was low, calm, but charged. I turned, the space between us narrowing to something unbearable. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches against the glass, a slow rhythm to match my heartbeat. He was standing close, too close for comfort, too close for reason. His eyes held something I wasn't prepared to see. Something that had been building in the silence, in the books we passed between us, in the stolen glances during dinner. And then, right there, at the threshold between kitchen tiles and living room carpet, his face tilted just slightly toward mine. The moment hung, raw, delicate, terrifying. Then the front door opened. A gust of cold air swept in with my husband's voice echoing through the hallway. I blinked. Stepped back. Pretended I was just grabbing the cinnamon. Before I begin the story and tell you how everything really happened, answer this question. Do you agree that everyone deserves a second chance after cheating? The day he came back was the beginning of something I still can't name. It was Thanksgiving week, and the house had taken on that cozy chaos of preparation, cranberry sauce bubbling on the stove, a half-thawed turkey occupying more space in the fridge than necessary, and me, pacing between rooms, pretending I wasn't nervous. But I was. I had every reason to be. He arrived just past 3. The wind outside had turned, bringing with it the bite of a true New England winter. I heard the gravel crunch beneath the tires before I saw his silhouette through the window. Taller. Broader. Something sharper in his presence than I remembered. He knocked out of habit, even though he had a key. My husband opened the door with that unmistakable pride men wear when their sons come home. Technically, not his son. But you'd never guess it from the way they laughed. I stood a step behind, my smile frozen in place, trying to ignore the strange pull that tightened in my stomach when I saw him again. "Hey," he said to me simply, and that one word was enough. Something shifted. Dinner that night was loud, full of sports talk and political tangents and my husband's outdated jokes about millennials. I busied myself refilling wine glasses, hoping the noise would muffle whatever had started echoing in my chest. It didn't. The next morning, I found him in the den, leafing through an old art book I'd left out without thinking. One of those oversized editions filled with portraits from the American realist period. He was seated by the window, light streaming in behind him, casting long, golden shadows. "You know," he said, without looking up, "this one kind of looks like you." I walked over, pretending curiosity, but the page was already open to her. A woman seated in profile, her expression unreadable, her hands folded with elegance and restraint. "That's why I like her," I said, too fast. He glanced up at me, that same unreadable expression flickering across his own face. I stepped back. We didn't talk for the rest of the morning. By afternoon, the house was full of guests. My husband's brother, a few neighbors, a family friend who always brought too many pies. I moved from room to room like a hostess on autopilot, refilling cheese trays and setting napkins with trembling hands I hoped no one noticed. But I noticed everything. Like how he watched me from across the room when he thought I wasn't looking. Like how our eyes met every time I turned too quickly. Like how the sound of his laugh kept pulling me out of conversations I had no interest in being part of. The tension only thickened after sunset. He offered to help me clean up while my husband gave some overlong speech about gratitude in the other room. We stood in the kitchen, shoulder to shoulder, washing and drying dishes like nothing was wrong. But everything was wrong. "Do you ever think about going somewhere else?" he asked quietly, not looking at me. "Where would I go?" "Anywhere," he said. "Everywhere." I didn't answer. I couldn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered downstairs, needing tea, or distraction, or anything that would drown the noise inside me. He was there. On the couch. Awake. Reading. The lamp beside him made the room look like a painting. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Not lately," I replied. We didn't talk after that. I turned on the kettle. He returned to his book. But I felt it, the way his presence filled the room. The way my breath shortened when he stood to leave. I stood there in the quiet long after he'd gone upstairs, staring at the steam curling from the cup in my hand. By Friday morning, something had changed. The weather had turned warm again, unseasonably so. My husband suggested we all take a walk through the trail behind our house. "Like old times," he said. We packed hot chocolate and wore light jackets. The trees were bare, the ground soft with damp leaves, the air filled with the scent of pine and decaying earth. I walked beside my husband, but my thoughts were behind me, with every soft footstep that wasn't his. Halfway through the hike, we paused at the overlook. The view stretched miles ahead, bare hills, winding roads, a patch of distant rooftops bathed in orange light. My husband took a photo. He offered to take one of me and his son. I hesitated. "Smile," he said, already raising his phone. We smiled. When the camera clicked, my breath caught. His shoulder was just barely touching mine. And I hated how much I noticed. That evening, I found the photo on my phone. He had airdropped it without saying a word. I stared at it for far too long, unable to tell whether I looked happy, nervous, or just lost. Later that night, I went to return a blanket to the guest room. I found him sitting on the floor, surrounded by open boxes of books. He was packing for his next semester. "This one's yours," he said, holding up the art book. I took it in silence. "You should keep it," I said. "I think it belongs here now." Our eyes locked. A beat passed. Then another. The tension mounted, quiet, suffocating. He opened his mouth, but before a single word came out, we heard a voice from the hallway. "My husband. You seen the wine opener?" I turned toward the door. My hand still gripped the spine of the book. My pulse still thundered in my ears. "I'll get it," I said. I left the room. That was the last time I saw him before everything changed. The next morning, he was gone. A note left on the kitchen table in handwriting I'd memorized long before I should have. "Heading out early. Tell Dad I'll call when I land." No signature. No goodbye. Just the memory of something that hadn't happened, but almost did. And the first spark of something I could no longer put out. Because what do you do when someone leaves, but takes a part of you with them? The morning after he left felt quieter than usual, and not because of the snow that had begun to fall gently through the gray sky outside. The house seemed to reject sound. My footsteps on the hardwood didn't echo the way they used to. Even the heating vents breathed softer. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator reminded me that time hadn't frozen entirely. I found myself standing in the kitchen, holding the book he gave back to me. The same art book we looked at together. My fingers traced the edges of the cover, then hovered over the page he had last stopped on. She was still there, the portrait. Still staring into the middle distance with that unreadable gaze. Still me, and somehow not me anymore. He had left before dawn. No goodbye, no glance back. A ride to the airport arranged quietly the night before. I didn't even hear the car. By the time my husband came downstairs, whistling off key and asking about scrambled eggs, I'd already put the book away and started the coffee. He didn't mention the absence. Not even once. Either he hadn't noticed the shift in the air, or he was choosing not to. I couldn't tell which unsettled me more. By afternoon, the weather had taken a turn. Snow that had started as a lazy drift now came down in thick, determined sheets. The wind howled like a warning, sending dry leaves skittering across the back porch. The kind of storm that forced everyone indoors. Trapped. Guess we're snowed in, my husband said, laughing as he opened the back door and watched the flakes gather on the deck chairs. Looks like it's gonna be just us for the weekend. Just us. The words hit differently now. We spent the day attempting normal. He watched a football game in the living room, shouting at the TV with a bowl of popcorn in his lap. I tried to read. Then to bake. Then to organize the cabinet I'd been ignoring for years. Nothing worked. I went upstairs to the guest room, maybe out of habit. The bed was still made, but the small signs of his presence were gone. No books stacked near the nightstand. No hoodie slung over the chair. The air didn't even smell like him anymore. I opened the window a crack, even though the cold rushed in like a slap. I needed to feel something. The next day blurred into the one before it. The storm refused to break. My husband suggested a game night to lift the mood. We dusted off an old Scrabble board, and he poured us wine. At first it was forced, word after word forming with more silence than laughter, but eventually we slipped into a rhythm. Or maybe just the illusion of one. He spelled out gather. I countered with pause. He grinned. That's what you always say when you want me to stop talking. When it was my turn again, I arranged the letters slowly, one by one. Flame. He looked at the word. Didn't expect that from you. I forced a smile. Didn't expect the snow either. Later, after he went to bed, I wandered through the house, checking windows, adjusting blankets, folding throws that didn't need folding. I passed the den and paused. The door was slightly ajar. Light leaked out from the small table lamp. I pushed it open. And there he was. He stood by the bookshelf, back turned, a few of his things scattered across the floor. I blinked, thinking my mind had finally broken loose from reality. I forgot a few books, he said without looking at me. I thought you left, I managed. I did. I'm going back tonight. But I had to come back for this. He held up an old, worn paperback. I couldn't even read the title. It didn't matter. I stepped into the room, unsure why I wasn't asking questions. He didn't explain. I didn't demand answers. The snow pressed against the windows in thick white waves. A storm outside. A storm inside. We stood there, saying nothing, the silence stretching like fabric between us. And then we kissed. It was as natural as breathing and just as necessary. There were no words before or after. Only the moment. Only the heat of something buried, unearthed again. When I returned to my room, I stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours. My husband's breath was steady beside me. The contrast tore something inside me. The next morning, my husband insisted we all go outside and shovel the walkway. Might as well be useful while we're stuck here, he said, handing me gloves and a scarf. The wind cut through our coats as we worked, side by side, not speaking. He cleared most of the driveway while I handled the porch steps. Snow piled high along the railing. And then I heard it. I'm flying back tomorrow. I turned. He stood a few steps away, shovel in hand, looking anywhere but at me. You came back just to tell me that? I asked. No, he said quietly. I came back because I wasn't done. That night, my husband made chili. He filled the house with the smell of onions, cumin, and smoked paprika. He set the table for 3. Let's have a real dinner, he said. We sat down together like some bizarre version of normal. Conversation drifted between awkward and artificial. Football. Weather. His plans to finish grad school. My husband asked if he'd considered moving back after graduation. I gripped my spoon so tightly my knuckles turned white. I don't think that would be a good idea, he said simply. When dinner ended, my husband went to the basement to check the fuse box. A flickering bulb had been bothering him for days. I stayed behind to clean the dishes. He stood behind me again. You won't hear from me, he said. Not unless you want to. I didn't reply. I just needed you to know, whatever this is, it's real for me. I turned to face him. Before I could answer, a crash echoed from the basement. We both rushed down. My husband had slipped on the stairs, twisted his ankle, nothing serious. But the look in his eyes when he saw us both standing there together, me holding the railing, him 2 steps behind, was enough to freeze the room. You good? I asked. He nodded, but didn't take his eyes off me. We helped him up. He winced with every step. Refused help once he reached the living room. Later, he called out to me from the couch. I'm fine, he said, adjusting the ice pack on his ankle. But he's got to go. The words sliced cleanly through the air. I stood frozen for a second. I mean it, he said. I don't care where. I don't care how. He's not staying here another night. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd felt before. And just like that, everything changed again. He didn't argue. That was the part that stunned me the most. When my husband told him to leave, he didn't ask why. He didn't plead. He didn't fight. He just nodded, quietly, and disappeared into the guest room without another word. I stood there in the living room, holding a damp towel I'd brought from the kitchen, still not sure if I was supposed to feel relieved or terrified. The next hour passed in brittle silence. My husband rested on the couch, flipping through TV channels with increasing irritation, stopping on nothing, watching nothing. His ankle was elevated, the ice pack slipping off slightly with every movement, but he didn't seem to notice or care. I sat in the armchair across from him, pretending to read an old magazine, the words blurring together into meaningless columns. Eventually he said, "He's not a kid anymore." I looked up. "No, he's not. You saw the way he looks at you." I didn't answer. He nodded to himself like I had. Then leaned back into the couch, closed his eyes, and didn't speak again until bedtime. Upstairs, behind the door of the guest room, the quiet felt heavier than usual. I didn't knock. I couldn't. The risk of being seen, of being overheard, of something unraveling too fast, it pinned me to my own hallway. But the house didn't sleep that night. Or maybe I didn't. Every creak of the floorboards, every wind-slammed shutter sent my heart jolting against my ribs. At one point I stepped out into the hallway and paused outside his door, my fingers curling into a fist before I could raise them to knock. I walked away. In the morning, the world was white again. Overnight, another round of snow had blanketed the driveway, the mailbox, even the path to the garage. My husband grumbled as he laced up his boots, insisting he was fine to shovel despite the limp in his walk. "He needs to be out of here before noon," he said as he wrapped a scarf around his neck. "Driveway's blocked. Car won't get out until I clear it." I nodded and poured coffee into his travel mug. He opened the door and braved the cold. By the time I went upstairs, the guest room was already half-packed. His duffel bag lay on the bed, neatly folded clothes arranged beside it. He was kneeling beside a box of old-school papers and books, sorting quickly, silently, mechanically. "I can drive you," I said. He paused but didn't look up. "I'll take an Uber," he replied. The roads are a mess. He finally raised his eyes. You think it matters now? Neither of us said anything after that. But he didn't order the Uber. 2 hours later, we were on the road. The snow had been plowed in thick walls along the highway, making the drive feel like we were tunneling through something ancient. He didn't speak for the first 20 minutes, his backpack at his feet, earbuds dangling from his collar but unused. I drove too carefully, too slowly, aware of how unnatural it all felt. The sun had begun to melt the top layer of snow, turning everything blindingly bright. I lied, he said finally. I glanced at him. About what? I said it didn't matter. It does. I tightened my grip on the wheel but said nothing. He continued, voice low and deliberate. I never expected this. Not from you. Not from me. Not like this. But it's the only thing I've felt in years that made sense. We drove the next 5 minutes in silence. The airport came into view just past the bend, low buildings, an American flag rippling sharply in the wind, arrivals and departures blinking on the giant LED board. I pulled into the drop-off lane. I can walk you in, I offered, hating myself the moment I said it. No. Just stay, he said. And then we kissed. It lasted only seconds. Long enough to scorch the air between us. Long enough to ruin whatever quiet understanding we'd tried to maintain. Long enough to burn itself into memory. He stepped out and shut the door. I couldn't even see him disappear into the building through the sun glare on the glass. I sat there for another 10 minutes, pretending I was just waiting for the lane to clear. By the time I got home, the house had already changed again. My husband had cleared the driveway, started laundry, and was halfway through replacing the burnt-out bulb in the hallway light. He looked up at me from the step stool. He make it? Yeah, I said. He's gone. He nodded like that answered more than one question. That night, we ate leftovers in front of the TV. Some game show with forced laughter and too many commercial breaks. He fell asleep with a half-empty soda in his hand. I cleaned the kitchen. Then wandered to the den. I pulled the art book from the shelf. The page was still folded at the portrait. The woman with the guarded expression. I stared at her until my eyes watered. 3 days passed. Then on the 4th day, I received an email. A forwarded ticket receipt, change of plans. A new flight itinerary. Not back to his campus, but somewhere else entirely. Destination, Portland. Departure, tomorrow. There was no message in the body of the email. Just the itinerary. No explanation. No reason. I stared at it for a full hour before I said anything to my husband. Did you know he's not going back to school? He didn't look up from his paper. He mentioned taking time off. Did he say where he's going? Nope. Then a pause. Why? I didn't answer. He folded the paper, sipped his coffee, and went upstairs. The next morning, I drove to the bookstore in town. I needed to be surrounded by silence that wasn't empty. I walked through the aisles like I was looking for something specific. I wasn't. Until I saw it. On the local artist's table near the register, a stack of small photography books, black and white images, soft matte covers, minimal design. I flipped through one. Landscapes. Hands. Details of light and shadow. Then I stopped. Page 43. It was me. In profile. Window light slashing across my cheek. Eyes lowered. My hand resting on the table. I closed the book. I didn't say a word. I bought it without looking at the cashier. Drove home without turning on the radio. Poured a glass of water I never drank. That night, my husband asked what I bought at the store. A book, I said. What kind? I looked at him across the kitchen table. Portraits, I said. Just portraits. He nodded. You always liked those. I smiled and changed the subject. But inside me, everything had already changed again. I kept the book hidden for 3 days. I told myself I needed time to decide what to do with it, though I never really had a plan. I tucked it behind old cookbooks no one ever opened, told my husband it had been a quiet day every time he asked. The pages burned in my memory. That photograph on page 43 never left me. He had taken it. It had to be him. The framing, the light, the moment, I remembered that moment. I remembered the way sunlight stretched across the dining room, the exact chair I was sitting in, the window open just enough to stir the curtains. It wasn't staged. I hadn't even known he had a camera then. But he'd captured it. That was the part that wouldn't leave me alone. By the weekend, my husband was already looking ahead to spring. He spent the entire Saturday morning planning repairs around the house, the front fence, the loose tile in the hallway, repainting the deck. He wanted to get ahead of things this year. Start fresh. While he searched for color samples online, I stood at the sink, staring out the window as the snow began to melt into slush. There was a quiet kind of urgency rising in me I couldn't ignore anymore. That photograph wasn't meant to be public. It wasn't meant to be found by strangers. It was meant for me. A message disguised as art. By early afternoon, I told him I was going to the grocery store. I didn't. Instead, I drove to the bus station. The ticket to Portland was easy enough to buy. One way, leaving in an hour. The woman at the counter didn't ask questions. I didn't offer any. I sat in the back corner of the waiting area, hood pulled low, pretending to read while my heart rattled behind my ribs. When the bus arrived, I hesitated only once before stepping on. The roads were still wet from the melt, and the bus smelled faintly of gasoline and leather, like every trip I'd ever taken away from home. It was late by the time we pulled into the city. Portland was quieter than I expected. Streetlights shimmered across the sidewalks in puddles of amber, and the cold there didn't bite so much as seep. I didn't have an address, just the name of a small hotel near the bookstore that had published the photography collection. A gamble. A hunch. The receptionist handed me a key without question. Room 202. The walls were thin. The carpet worn. But I didn't sleep. In the morning, I walked. Past cafes with chalkboard menus, past art galleries with handwritten flyers taped to the windows. The bookstore was closed until 10. I waited on a bench outside with a coffee that had long since gone cold. I watched every person who passed. None of them were him. When the shop opened, I went inside and pretended to browse, even though I went straight to the display table. The books were still there. Same soft covers. Same weight in my hands. I bought another copy. And this time, I asked the clerk, "Do you know the photographer? The one behind this?" She looked up, curious. "Yeah. He does local work, but he's not here much. Travels around. He dropped these off a couple weeks ago." "You a fan?" I nodded. "Did he sign yours?" she asked, flipping open a copy from the stack. I shook my head. "Sometimes he leaves notes inside. He's weird like that." I bought the second copy anyway. Back in the hotel room, I flipped through every page. Nothing. No notes. No signatures. I stared at the ceiling for an hour before I gave in. I remembered something small from months ago. A moment in passing, when he'd mentioned a place he liked, a small cabin-style lodge by a lake outside the city. Quiet enough to think, he'd said. It wasn't much. But it was something. I took a cab. The lake was still half frozen, snow crusted over the banks like thin sheets of glass. The lodge looked abandoned from the outside, but the lights in the lobby were on. I stepped inside slowly, unsure if I'd say his name aloud or just turn around and leave. But I didn't have to. He was there. Sitting by the fireplace. Legs stretched out. Book in hand. He looked up when the door opened. His expression didn't change for a second. Then it did, barely. Something flickered. I wasn't sure you'd find me, he said. I wasn't sure either. We didn't speak for a long time after that. He poured me tea. Sat across from me. The fire cracked gently in the background. You saw it, he said eventually. I nodded. Why did you use it? He didn't answer at first. Just leaned forward, elbows on knees, and looked into the fire. Because it was the only thing that ever felt true, he said. And for a long time, neither of us said anything more. When night fell, the lake outside glowed under the full moon. We stood by the window, shoulder to shoulder, and said nothing. Then we spent night together. I left before sunrise. The air was colder than it had been in weeks. I pulled my coat tight, walked to the edge of the lake where the snow cracked beneath my boots. I looked back once, saw the light still on in the room. His silhouette faint in the window. By the time I returned home, the kitchen smelled like cinnamon and lemon cleaner. My husband was sitting at the table, sipping tea, the newspaper folded beside him. He looked up with a soft smile. Good timing, he said. Was just about to text you. I figured you needed space. I froze. You okay? He asked, watching me closely. I nodded. I just needed a few days to clear my head. He stood, walked over, and kissed the top of my head. Glad you're back. I made coffee, sat across from him, tried not to tremble. And then he said, casually, by the way. The bookstore called. My blood ran cold. He continued, they said someone left a package for you there. A guy. No name. I blinked. Did they say what it was? He shrugged. Didn't ask. Figured you'd go pick it up. I smiled. Tried to hide the spinning. I will, I said. Tomorrow. But I didn't know if I would. Or if I could. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake with the image of his silhouette at the cabin burned into my mind, and now the unexpected weight of my husband's words pressing against everything. A package left at the bookstore. No name. A trace of him I hadn't asked for. A signal? A goodbye? I couldn't tell. But it sat there now like an unopened door, one I was afraid to walk through and too haunted to ignore. By morning I told myself I'd act normal. I made coffee. Folded laundry. Wiped the counter even though it was already clean. My husband left early for a dentist appointment, casually tossing over his shoulder, "Don't forget your package." The second the door shut behind him, I grabbed my coat and car keys and left. The bookstore was quiet. Mid-morning weekday quiet. A bell jingled gently as I stepped inside. The same clerk from before looked up and smiled. "You're back," she said. "1 second." She disappeared behind a short curtain. My fingers dug into the strap of my bag. A part of me hoped it was a mistake. That it wasn't from him. That it was something else entirely. But then she returned, with a plain brown envelope. "Here you go." He said not to open it until you got home, she added with a grin, lowering her voice. Mysterious type. I thanked her, barely. In the car, I almost opened it. My fingers hovered at the corner of the flap, but something stopped me. Not guilt. Not fear. Something else. I drove home with the envelope sitting on the passenger seat like it had a pulse. I didn't go inside right away. I sat in the garage, engine off, staring at the dashboard. The weight of the envelope felt unreal. Heavy in my lap. Light in my hands. Inside, I peeled it open slowly. No letter. Just a photograph. One I hadn't seen before. It was the same room, the cabin, the fireplace, but from a different angle. I was in it. Not posed. Not looking at the camera. Just standing by the window, staring out over the lake. The light behind me was soft and pale. My reflection blurred in the glass. On the back, one line in his handwriting. You looked like you belonged to no one and everything at once. I stared at the words for a long time, until they blurred. I didn't tell my husband. That afternoon, I went for a walk. A long one, without direction. I passed the same houses I'd passed for years, but they all looked like sets now, frozen in place, waiting for something to happen. I found myself at the lake at the edge of town. The ice had finally cracked. Ducks drifted in small clusters through the channels of thaw. The wind carried a bite, but it was different. Alive. Awake. When I got home, the house smelled like fresh paint. I started the fence, my husband said proudly, wiping his hands on an old rag. Went with the chestnut stain like we talked about. We hadn't talked about it. Or maybe we had, months ago. I smiled anyway. Nodded. Let him keep his joy. But that night, I couldn't sleep again. Not from restlessness, but from weight. My chest felt full of something too heavy to name. I got up. Padded down the hallway. I opened the guest room door. It was exactly how he'd left it. The chair in the corner still held the imprint of his jacket. The edge of the window still bore a faint fingerprint on the glass. I walked in, turned on the lamp, sat on the bed. Then I saw it. Something tucked behind the headboard. Almost invisible unless you were looking for it. A folded piece of paper. No envelope. I reached for it, my hands already shaking. It wasn't a letter. It was a sketch. Done in pencil, rough and precise all at once. It was of me, again, same profile, same quiet distance, but this time, something different. My eyes weren't lowered. They were looking forward. Focused. Bold. And beneath it, just two words. Come find me. The next morning, I said I needed to visit my sister in Providence. She invited me to stay for the weekend, I said. She's been going through something. I want to check in. My husband didn't question it. She could use you, he said. Drive safe. I packed light. Just enough to make the lie feel real. But I didn't go to Providence. I took the train instead. Followed nothing more than instinct and memory. Checked into a hotel just outside the city again. I waited. Nothing happened. I spent 2 days walking. Watching people. Thinking. Wanting to call him and not knowing what I'd say. Wanting to forget and knowing I couldn't. The night before I planned to return home, I sat in a quiet cafe near the river. A storm moved in fast, slapping the windows with rain. I sipped weak coffee and stared at a candle flickering in a glass jar on the table. A couple laughed behind me. I felt outside of everything. And then, as I reached for my coat, someone slid into the seat across from me. He didn't speak. He just looked at me. Rainwater in his hair. Breath caught in his throat. He didn't need to explain how he knew I was here. Somehow I had known too. I said nothing. He slid something across the table. A key. What is this? I asked quietly. It's a space, he said. I signed a lease. It's small, but it's mine. I want to fill it with the truth. He paused. Even if that truth is complicated. I stared at the key. Not silver. Not gold. Just plain, smooth, functional. Real. I can't just disappear, I said. I'm not asking you to, he replied. I'm just telling you I won't. That night, I didn't return to the hotel. And in the morning, I received a message from my husband. Not a voicemail. Not a text. A photo. It was me. Taken from the front porch of our house. I was standing in the doorway, smiling at someone off frame. Only it wasn't recent. It was from weeks ago. And attached was just one question. When were you going to tell me the truth? My chest hollowed. The lie had reached home before I did. I stared at the message longer than I should have. The photo, grainy but unmistakable, was a moment I hadn't realized had been captured. I was standing on our porch, face turned, smiling in that distracted way I only ever did with him. The frame cut off the other figure beside me, but it didn't matter. The look on my face said enough. My husband had seen it. My chest hollowed out. My hands felt like glass. The train ride home was slow and disorienting. Everything outside the window passed in washed-out colors, but I couldn't focus on a single detail. My thoughts flickered between panic and resolve, guilt and denial. The rhythm of the tracks beneath me was the only thing keeping me anchored. When I got back to the house, his truck wasn't in the driveway. That should have brought relief. It didn't. It only made the silence inside the house more unbearable. Every room I passed through felt paused, half lived in, mid-thought, like the place itself was holding its breath. A mug in the sink. His jacket on the chair. A half-folded towel on the bed. Then I saw it. The framed photograph from our last family holiday had been taken off the wall and laid face down on the console table in the hallway. The smallest move, but louder than anything he could have said. I found a note on the kitchen counter. Simple pen on a torn grocery list. Taking a few days. Don't call. No signature. No mention of where. I stood there, staring at the uneven scrawl, and felt something inside me shatter, not in drama, but in silence. By the second day, I started pacing. The walls were too familiar. Every room echoed with something he'd said or built or fixed. The guest room was still untouched. I hadn't entered it since that last morning. I passed the door more than once, hand brushing the knob, and kept walking. I needed out. I drove. Without plan or map. Just movement. An hour later, I was outside the city, the suburbs replaced by long stretches of empty road and bare trees. I stopped at a gas station for no reason. Bought coffee I didn't drink. Watched a couple laugh while filling up their car, the girl playfully slapping the guy's arm. I felt like I was underwater. I checked into a roadside inn, one of those places that still used actual keys and handed you breakfast coupons you knew you'd never use. The room was cold. I didn't turn on the TV. Just sat at the edge of the bed, clutching my phone. No new messages. Nothing from him either. I thought about texting. Thought about deleting everything. Thought about disappearing. Instead, I went back home. The next morning, I woke up early and started cleaning. Not out of duty, but compulsion. I emptied drawers, boxed clothes I hadn't worn in years, tossed expired spices and broken pens. Movement helped. Until I got to the attic. I hadn't been up there in ages. The light bulb flickered as I pulled the string. Dust floated in thick clouds. Boxes of old holiday decorations, high school yearbooks, and forgotten keepsakes filled the space. I didn't even know what I was looking for. Then I saw it, an old storage bin with his name on the side. I opened it. Inside were notebooks, sketch pads, and one of the cameras I hadn't seen in years. The same model he used to take those photos. I picked it up. It was lighter than I remembered. I pressed the power button. Dead battery. I put it down. Underneath the camera, wrapped in a flannel shirt, was a bundle of undeveloped film rolls. 5 of them. All labeled with faint marker. One said simply, House. I stared at it. My hands trembled. I took the rolls and left the rest. Drove into town to the only photo lab I knew still existed. The man behind the counter looked like he'd stepped out of another decade, all mustache and denim. He didn't ask questions. Just handed me a claim ticket and told me to come back the next day. That night, the house felt quieter than ever. I slept on the couch. I didn't dream. The next afternoon, I picked up the envelope. My heart pounded the entire drive back. I didn't even wait to get home. I parked in a grocery store lot and ripped it open. The first few shots were familiar rooms in the house, corners I'd passed through 100 times. Light streaming through the kitchen window. The dining room in golden hour. A mug on the sill. All beautiful. All benign. Then they changed. Me, in the guest room, reading by the window. Me, at the sink, laughing. I couldn't even remember why. Me, asleep on the couch. These weren't posed. These weren't moments I'd ever been aware of. But they weren't sinister. They were reverent. Then I got to the last photo. It was me, standing outside in the snow, holding the art book. And he was in the background. Blurry, but unmistakable. Looking at me like I was the only real thing in the world. I put the photos away, hands shaking. I didn't cry. Instead, I drove. I drove until my gas tank dipped near empty. Pulled into a parking lot overlooking the lake outside town. Got out of the car. The wind cut across my face. It felt deserved. And then, behind me, I heard the unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel. I turned. It wasn't him. It was my husband. He stepped out slowly, hands in his coat pockets. No anger in his expression. Just something hollow. Something resigned. I thought you'd be here, he said. I didn't move. I came to say something. I waited. He looked at me, then past me, to the lake. I'm selling the house. My breath caught. You don't have to leave, he added. But I do. And just like that, he turned, got back in the car, and drove away. I stood there long after his car disappeared. The cold seeped through my coat, but I didn't move. The wind off the lake carried the faint scent of pine and thawing earth. It should have reminded me of spring, of something beginning. Instead, it felt like the end of something that had already been dying long before I admitted it. The house wasn't just a structure. It held years, versions of ourselves we'd grown out of but never let go. It held Sunday pancakes, late-night arguments, birthdays we celebrated with cake from the same grocery store. And it held secrets. One secret too heavy to carry anymore. When I returned, I moved through the house like a stranger. I didn't touch anything. I couldn't. I just sat on the bottom step of the stairs, watching the shadows shift across the walls as the sun dipped. I thought about the photo. The sketch. The key he had placed in my hand without saying a word. The next morning, I found myself packing, not everything, not officially. Just a few bags. A mix of instinct and necessity. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew I couldn't stay in the same rooms where every object now asked a question I couldn't answer. I booked a short-term rental near the edge of the city. A place meant for transitions. The kind where furniture doesn't belong to anyone and nothing carries history. The air felt different there, emptier, but clearer. In the following days, I started a new rhythm. I applied for a part-time position at the local library. Something simple, something grounding. The kind of job where silence wasn't awkward, it was expected. I filled my free hours walking unfamiliar neighborhoods, finding favorite benches, avoiding places I might see him, or worse, where I might not. But he found me anyway. It was a Thursday. Rain had swept in fast and angry, slashing sideways against the windows of the library. I was shelving returns when I felt it, that prickling awareness, the instinct that someone is watching you. I turned slowly. He stood just past the counter, half wet, a hood shoved back off his hair, a single photo book tucked under his arm. Not the one with my portrait. A different one. He didn't speak. Neither did I. He walked past me down one of the aisles like it was the most natural thing in the world. I followed. When we were alone between the shelves, he finally said, "You left without telling me." I nodded. "You disappeared," he added. "You did it first," I said quietly. We stood there, the rain thudding against the windows, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above us. "I'm not going to ask you to explain anything," he said. "I just came to tell you I'm not waiting anymore." He didn't say it with resentment. Just fact. He handed me the book and left before I could respond. Back in the apartment, I opened it. Inside was a page marked with a sticky note. On it, a handwritten time and place. A cafe near the pier. Tomorrow, 4 p.m. No name. No promise. No pressure. Just a door. I almost didn't go. But I did. He was already there when I arrived. A table by the window, one hand wrapped around a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. He watched me approach, eyes unreadable. I sat across from him without speaking. "I got an offer," he said after a moment. "An exhibit in Chicago. Real gallery. They want me to show the full series. Including the portraits." I stared at him. "They asked if I had the rights. I said I did. But I'm not going to use them if you say no." I stayed silent. He waited. "I didn't take those photos to expose anything," he continued. "They were for me. For what I felt when I looked at you. That quiet defiance. That sadness you never said out loud. I don't know who I am in them," I whispered. He shook his head. "You do. That's why they scare you." I looked out the window. The water moved slowly past the dock, dark and heavy. A storm brewing in the distance. He reached into his coat pocket and slid something across the table. It was the key again. Same one. "I'm not asking for anything. But the door's still open." He stood and left. This time, I didn't stop him. I didn't return to the apartment right away. I walked until it got dark. Through the market. Past old brick storefronts. Down streets I didn't know the names of. When I finally came home, the silence wasn't comforting. It pressed in. The key stayed on the table. By morning, I had made a decision. I went back to the old house one last time. It was half empty now. Boxes stacked by the door. The hallway echoing without the furniture. I walked through each room like I was saying goodbye to versions of myself I'd never get back. In the dining room, I found something unexpected. A note. Not from him. From my husband. Just a torn piece of newspaper tucked under a coaster, his handwriting scrawled across the edge. I didn't sell the house yet. I thought you should decide. That was all. No signature. No anger. Just a choice. And suddenly, I realized everyone had left a door open for me. But none of them told me which one to walk through. That night, I unlocked the door to his place for the first time. I stood in the middle of the room, suitcase still in my hand, and looked around. It was small. Quiet. His things, but no clutter. His presence, but no demands. I didn't unpack. I just sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the key in my palm, wondering what it meant now that I had used it. Then the doorknob turned behind me. He stepped in, eyes wide, breath caught. And before either of us said a word, my phone buzzed. A message. From my husband. One sentence. I think you left something in the attic. And I knew this wasn't over. I stared at the message longer than I should have. I think you left something in the attic. Just one sentence. No punctuation. No context. No sign of accusation. And yet, it carried more weight than anything he had ever said aloud. I read it 3 times, then once more, as if the meaning might shift between readings. It didn't. It just waited. Quiet. Unblinking. Behind me, the room stayed still. He hadn't asked about the text. He stood near the window, watching the streetlights cast blurred gold onto the pavement, the kind of silence that carries restraint instead of peace. I knew he'd seen my face when I read it. Knew he understood something had shifted. But he said nothing. That was his way. I need to go, I said, finally. He didn't ask where. He didn't try to stop me. I walked out into the night with the key still in my coat pocket. The drive back to the house was surreal. Familiar roads blurred by rain and memory. The house came into view like a photograph slowly developing, every detail clearer and colder the closer I got. I parked on the curb, not the driveway. Like I didn't belong anymore. Or maybe never had. Inside, the lights were off. But I knew my way through the dark. The attic ladder creaked the way it always had. The bulb flickered once before warming into a soft, weak yellow. The air smelled of insulation, pine, and dusted over years. I scanned the space slowly. Nothing had changed. Boxes. Old furniture. A rolled-up rug. The same storage bin I had once opened weeks before. I hesitated, unsure what I was even looking for. Then I saw it. A wooden box. Not plastic. Not labeled. Just wood. Locked with an old brass clasp. I didn't remember it. That alone was enough to make my pulse pick up. It was tucked behind a row of Christmas wreaths. I dragged it into the center of the attic and sat down, the wood cool against my legs. The latch opened without a key. No resistance. No ceremony. Inside, photographs. Hundreds. Some of them were ours. Old family shots. Vacations. Birthdays. But most were not. They were of me. At the farmer's market. At the mailbox. In the car, behind the wheel, unaware. Carrying groceries. Reading on the porch. Laughing with a neighbor. Every angle. Every season. Years of them. I froze. They weren't his. They weren't the kind he took, artful, intimate, stolen in the way only trust can allow. These were something else. Chronological. Clinical. And all taken by someone who had been watching quietly. Routinely. There were timestamps written on the back of each one. In my husband's handwriting. A neat row of digits and dates. Some going back more than 5 years. 5 years. I dropped the stack. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I pulled out more. Me, sitting alone in the kitchen. Me, pacing in the backyard. Me, brushing hair behind my ear. So many that I didn't even remember the moments they were from. So many I felt dizzy. Then, buried near the bottom, something worse. A receipt. Framed prints. Enlarged. Sent to a gallery in Portland. My name listed under subject. Not photographer. The curator's name. The date. Last month. I stumbled back from the box like it had burned me. Everything went silent in my head. The buzzing of the bulb faded. The air pressed closer, thicker. My pulse hammered in my throat. He'd sent them. Not the one I left for. The one I left behind. And suddenly, I understood the look on his face when he told me he hadn't sold the house yet. He was never going to. He wasn't leaving. I was supposed to. He had been documenting me. Preserving me in stillness. Not as punishment. Not even out of jealousy. But because he couldn't imagine a version of me that existed without him. He wanted to own the memory. Frame it before it slipped. He knew I would leave. And he wanted to decide how I'd be remembered. I slammed the box shut, the sound splitting the attic air. My legs moved on instinct, carrying me back down the steps, through the hall, out the door. I didn't stop until I was behind the wheel again. The box sat beside me. I didn't know why I brought it. Maybe because it didn't belong there anymore. Maybe because neither did I. The roads blurred again. Halfway to the apartment, I pulled over. Somewhere unfamiliar. No landmarks. Just darkness and a dim yellow streetlight overhead. I got out of the car, walked to the nearest dumpster behind an abandoned storefront, and tossed the box inside. The lid slammed against the metal walls like a final word I didn't want to speak. Back in the car, my breath finally caught. Then I drove. When I got back, he was still awake. Sitting on the couch. A blanket wrapped over his lap. A book closed on his chest. He looked at me as I closed the door. Something in his eyes shifted, but not with fear. Not with expectation. "Did you find it?" he asked. I nodded. He didn't press. And I didn't speak. I crossed the room, sat beside him, and stared at the wall for what felt like hours. And for the first time in this entire unraveling, I didn't know who I was more afraid of. Him. Or myself.